I am not afraid of abandoned buildings. I am afraid of those that only pretend to be abandoned. The Golden Kingdom is a trap, and I was locked inside, knowing that my family was just 2 blocks away. But there was nothing they could do to help me. You must know this. King Gideon has 5 rules, and the scariest part is this. If you break the rules, he doesn't come for you. He comes for the thing that makes you happy. And for me, that is my wife and children. I broke them all. And this is what happened to me. This time, driving in from California, we brought not only our bags, but also way too much hope. My children were obsessed with King Gideon, and perhaps that very obsession blinded me. I saw the staff's overly wide smiles. I heard the obsessively cheerful music, but I just put it down to magic. When the fireworks ended and the crowd thinned out, I realized I had left my minivan keys by the Golden King fountain. It wasn't just a lapse in attention. It was an invitation that I accepted myself. I sent my wife and children back to the hotel, assuring them I would be back in 10 minutes. When I picked up the keys, it was 12:45 a.m. An absolute silence fell. The staff were no longer standing in neat rows. They had vanished. The last visitors hurriedly slipped through the main gates, which immediately began to close with a deafening clang. I ran. I screamed, begging them to wait. But the only thing that answered me was a technical sound. The park wasn't just closing, it was shutting down. Somewhere deep underground, I heard a hum and a grating noise, as if an enormous mechanical beast was settling down to sleep. When the gates slammed shut, sealing me inside, all the lights on Main Street went out, except for the emergency reddish lighting. In this darkness, the only things glowing were the white gloves of the mascots parked near the buildings. They stood motionless, but their smiles, which had seemed joyful during the day, now looked like a frozen snarl. I was locked in the Golden Kingdom, and just 2 blocks away, my family was peacefully sleeping, about to become the main stake in this game. The panic didn't last long. Once I realized the massive gates were locked, the instinct for self-preservation took over. I ran back to Main Street, hoping to find an unlocked staff door or an emergency exit button. All the doors were metal, secured by electronic locks. There was no electricity, only the emergency red lighting, which made the park look like the veins of some gigantic, sick organism. The time was 1:15 a.m., and then I heard it. First, it was a faint click, then a barely perceptible but perfectly clear sound. A sound I had heard all day, only now it was the only sound. Music. That same obsessively cheerful, cyclical melody from the park. It started playing again, but not from the speakers. It seemed to emanate from the ground itself, from the air, and it was slightly slower than during the day. It sounded like a gramophone winding down. I hid behind an ice cream kiosk. My brain screamed, "Find an exit!" But something inside ordered me to find an answer. This park wasn't just locked down, it was turned on. Next to the kiosk was a janitor's cart. It had been abandoned, and on the seat lay a thick leather folder. It was the Daily Technical Staff Journal, Sector F. I opened it with trembling hands, using the light from my phone. Most of the text was dedicated to maintenance, but on the last pages, handwritten in a shaky, hurried script, I found what I was looking for. It felt like a confession or a warning. The header read, 5 strict rules for the Night Stalker, not for rookies. I quickly flipped through. The rules were strange, illogical, but they felt vital. And the very first rule was about the music. Survival rule number 1. If the music stops, it's not a technical error. You must immediately find secure cover and wait in absolute silence until it returns. I read this and a cold sweat broke out. The music was playing. That meant I was safe. For now. I started to realize that in this park, on and off had completely different meanings. The music wasn't just background noise. It was a clock. And if the clock stops, the hunting hour begins. I turned the page. I needed to understand who or what was hunting. I held the journal so tightly that the leather creaked. The music, that sickly, cheerful waltz, was playing, but it no longer comforted me. I knew it wasn't just a melody. It was the park's protective shell. I had to move. But first, I needed to figure out where the attacks might happen. Where was the power source? Where was the control center? I exited Main Street and turned into the pirate-themed zone. It was dark here, and the humidity was stronger. There was an artificial pond nearby. But the most terrifying thing was the echo. The music, which had seemed omnipresent, now reflected off the water and the tunnel walls, turning not into a waltz, but into a distorted, layered scream that sounded like it was coming from underwater. The time was 1:45 a.m. I was starting to read the next rule when it happened. The music stopped. Not abruptly, not with a click, but it faded, as if someone had slowly, deliberately turned the volume knob to 0. The final note sounded like a quiet, mocking sigh, and then an absolute silence fell. The kind of silence that only exists in space or deep underground. My brain didn't have time to react, but my body moved on its own. Rule number 1, find secure cover, kicked in. I dove into a dark, decorative grotto meant for photo opportunities. I pressed myself against the wall, not daring to breathe. And then I realized why the silence was dangerous. When the music was playing, it masked the sounds. Now, in the absolute quiet, I started to hear. First, water dripping into the pond, then a faint metallic grinding from somewhere far away. But the most horrible thing was different. I heard a slap, a dull, wet slap, as if a huge, soft glove had hit wet pavement. The slap repeated, and it was rhythmic. I pulled out my phone and barely dared to point the flashlight. On the wet path leading to the ride, I saw him. King Gideon, the life-sized mascot I had seen during the day, was standing where he hadn't been a minute ago. He wasn't moving. He was just standing in a perfect pose with one hand raised. But his huge white glove was wet, and on the wet asphalt there were traces of damp prints, as if he had been walking, slapping his gloves against the ground. I couldn't move, and then, after 3 minutes of agonizing silence, the music returned, softly at first, then louder, quickly drowning out the sounds of the slapping gloves. The music was my salvation, my only protector, and it gave me back my breath. I realized I now knew the rules, and I had to move before they stopped the music again. The music was playing, but now it wasn't cheerful. It was mocking. Every joyful beat reminded me that I was trapped in a nightmare. With trembling fingers, I flipped through the janitor's journal until I found the second rule. It was underlined several times, and next to it was a hurried, gruesome caricature of King Gideon. Survival rule number 2. Do not look into the eyes of stationary mascots after 2:30 a.m. Their smiles are not meant for you. If a mascot is looking at you, you must convince it that you are not there. I looked at the time, 2:10 a.m. Time was running out. I began moving cautiously through the pirate zone, holding my phone in one hand and the journal in the other. And I understood what the rule meant. The mascots were positioned around the park, not randomly, but as part of the scenery. They stood in perfect frozen poses, creating scenes. But as I walked past these scenes, I felt as if I was being scanned. In a narrow passage, I saw him again. King Gideon, about 2.5 meters tall, his huge golden crown gleamed slightly in the red emergency light. His eyes, 2 perfectly round black discs, stared straight ahead toward the ride entrance. But his smile, it wasn't just wide, it was flat, perfect, without a single wrinkle, as if stretched over a metal frame. I remembered. Their smiles are not meant for you. During the day, that smile was for children, for cameras. At night, it was vacant. I walked past, trying not to look him in the eyes, pressing myself against the wall. And then I stumbled. My phone slipped from my hand, and as I fell, the flashlight beam struck King Gideon's eyes directly. The moment the light hit his eyes, his smile twitched. Not much, but enough for me to notice. For a fraction of a second, that perfect, flat smile constricted, as if his facial muscles couldn't hold. And then his head, which had been stationary, slowly turned towards me. It wasn't a movement, it was a change of scene, as if he had been waiting for me to look. I instantly dropped to the floor, hid my head behind a toolbox, and froze, gasping. Silence fell again. I didn't hear the slapping gloves, but I felt his vacant gaze burning through the box. I understood. Convince it that you were not there. If he saw that I was scared, he would act. I had to become part of the decorations. I lay still, trying to relax every muscle until my body became heavy and motionless, like an abandoned sack. Only after a minute did his head slowly, jerkily return to its original position. I was out of his scene. I was safe. For now. When I finally dared to stand up, I didn't run. I started moving very slowly, literally pressing myself against the decorations. I realized the park wasn't just locked, it had transformed. By day, it was a stage for the audience. By night, it became a stage for them. I walked past the souvenir shop. Behind the massive, clean glass stood dozens of life-sized mascots. But now they weren't just merchandise. They were extras, and their vacant gazes, fixed on the center of the street, were waiting for me to step into the frame. I noticed one thing: wet prints. After the nightly watering, The paths were damp, and everywhere I saw parked mascots. There were faint, almost invisible wet prints of their huge paws or boots, leading from one spot to another. This meant they had moved during the short pauses when I blinked or turned away. They weren't walking. They were teleporting or moving at inhuman speed when unseen. I entered the medieval quarter zone. It was darker here, and the decorations, stone towers and torches, seemed more sinister. The Golden Knight mascot stood on a tower. His shiny armor looked like empty, screaming shapes in the darkness. I remembered laughing at his silly pose during the day. Now, I tried to pass so that he couldn't see my silhouette or my shadow. I was halfway through when I heard it again. A slap. Quiet, wet, rhythmic. It was coming from above. I froze. It was the Golden Knight. His pose on the tower had changed. His massive, decorative sword, which had been raised in greeting during the day, was now lowered and pointing directly at me. And I saw it. On the stone masonry beneath him, where it shouldn't have been, was a wet glove. He must have climbed down the wall and returned to his pose, leaving the damp print as a warning. The quiet, relentless waltz was playing. The music was my only salvation, but now I felt it wasn't protecting me. It was taunting me, telling them exactly how much time they had left before they could move freely. At that moment, I understood the main truth. To survive, I mustn't avoid them. I had to convince them that I was just another decoration, part of the scene. But how do you convince a mascot who is looking for only one thing? For you to become their replacement. The music was playing, but I moved with absolute, cold resolve. My only hope was to find a staff exit that hadn't been blocked by the main system. To do this, I had to cross the park's central transportation zone. I found the third and fourth entries in the journal, written on the back of an oil-stained map of the service tunnels. Survival rule number 3. If the Happy Train attraction turns on, do not stand on the tracks. It only drives home, to the depot. And the depot is not meant for people. I looked ahead. The train was standing on the tracks at the Old West Station, and then its headlights flashed. This wasn't a smooth startup. It was an instant, aggressive activation. Thick, black smoke poured from its chimney, instantly filling the station with the smell of overheated oil and something metallic and burnt. And it moved. Not slowly, not ceremoniously, but with incredible, wild speed. Its wheels screeched on the rails, creating such a deafening roar that even the music couldn't drown it out. It was like a mad, enraged mechanism. I dove onto the platform, pressing myself against a column. The train roared past. The cabin was empty. But in the window of the last carriage, I saw something that froze my blood. Inside sat about 5 empty children's mascot costumes, swaying from side to side. They were lifeless, but their empty eyes, fixed forward, seemed to be waiting for someone. It sped past and vanished into the tunnel. I realized I had just barely missed becoming its cargo. I ran on, heading toward the building marked on the map as the King's Room, the place where the main mascot was rumored to be prepared. I hoped to find something valuable there. An emergency control panel or a second set of keys. Near the king's room, I found the final, fourth entry from the janitor. Survival rule number 4. There must only be one king in the king's room. If there are 2, you must leave immediately and must not look at the second one. I carefully opened the door. It was a dimly lit room, like a wardrobe. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it, King Gideon. The very one I had seen on Main Street, perfectly clean, with an immaculate golden crown. He stood facing me. My gaze dropped to the corner. The janitor's script said there should be only one. In the corner, on an old, dirty chair, sat the second King Gideon. He was almost identical to the first, but his costume was worn, and his crown was dented and dull. He sat with his head lowered. The second king slowly raised his head. His eyes, black discs, were fixed not on me, but on the first king on the pedestal. At that moment, the first king, who was facing me, winked. Very slowly, unnaturally. And then his perfect smile began to spread across his face, revealing something sharp and metallic. I understood. The first king was the trap. The second, the broken one, was waiting for me to turn to him. I bolted out of the room. I had broken rule number 4. I looked at the second king, and I saw the first king wink. They know. I bolted out of the king's room and rushed onto Main Street. The waltz, that cursed music, was now louder and faster, as if the park itself was laughing at me. I had broken rule number 4. I looked, and they definitely knew. Ahead in the central plaza, I saw King Gideon, the one who winked, emerge from around the corner. He wasn't running. He was gliding across the wet pavement, his movement unnatural. Too fast for walking, but not quite a run. He was already 30 meters away. In a panic, I turned and ran in the opposite direction from the exit, towards the back of the park where a service tunnel was located. And then the music abruptly stopped. An absolute silence fell, and I heard an entire symphony of horror. Not just the slapping of one pair of gloves, but multiple slapping sounds coming from all directions. I realized King Gideon was not alone. All the mascots that had been decorations were now moving. I had broken rule number 1 by running into the silence. I sprinted through the Adventure Bay zone, hearing scraping and dull thuds right behind me. I reached a small service door marked evacuation. I yanked the handle, locked. But nearby on a broken crate, I saw the last 5th entry from the janitor. He must have left it intentionally, knowing that sooner or later, someone would reach this spot. Survival rule number 5, the final rule. To exit, you must sacrifice something that makes you happy. Something that belongs only to you. Insert it into the door lock. Otherwise, you will become part of it. My hands frantically searched my pockets. What makes me happy? Money? My phone? Number? It was my family. It was my memory of them. I couldn't give away a memory. In that moment of silence, whispering, I heard it again. The sound was getting closer. The metallic, chilling shush of King Gideon. I pulled my wedding ring from my pocket. Thin, gold, the very one I had worn since the day we left California. It was the symbol of my family, my hope, my happiness. It was the only thing that belonged solely to me, besides my life. I didn't think. I jammed the ring into the lock slot. It became stuck, tightly, permanently. In the same second, the lock clicked. The music instantly at full volume roared back, and the door flew open. I scrambled out into a narrow, dark alley behind the park. As the door slammed shut behind me, I managed to see. King Gideon was standing 10 steps away. He stopped. He couldn't pass through the door that required a sacrifice, but his enormous white glove stretched through the crack and tried to feel for my ring. I ran towards my hotel, towards my family, leaving the single symbol of my happiness behind me in the darkness. If this story about the Golden Kingdom made you feel a chill, or if you now look at theme parks with suspicion, please give this video a like. This will help spread the word about these rules to more people. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next location that is hiding its terrible rules of survival. Write in the comments, which of the 5 rules do you think is the most dangerous? And which city or tourist spot, in your opinion, is hiding its own sinister rules under the mask of fun?